Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm extremely excited to be here almost at TEDx Western Connecticut State University 2013. My name is Daniel Martin. I'm an associate professor of management at Cal State East Bay, a visiting faculty member at Stanford's Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, and I'm also the recently Director of Research for the Charter for Compassion. Today I'd like to talk to you about something that's really applied work and I think of great interest to those in the university environment, but we'll see that this is something that can scale to other types of environments as well. So we'll be talking specifically about elevation mapping and understanding its impact in regards to witnessing compassion in one's environment as prosocial behavior. So before we even go any further, let's talk a little bit about behavioral definitions of compassion. Compassion is something that we usually think about in terms of philosophy or religion, but in fact, as psychology will show, there can be behavioral definitions of compassion, and we'll give it three elements here today. The first element really is being aware of another person's suffering, noticing this. The second component is having an affective component, empathetically feeling the other person's pain. In other words, the emotional side. The third action is the behavioral side, and this is really doing something to ameliorate or ease that person's suffering. So here we have something that can actually be witnessed, and this becomes really important. I'll give you an example. Here's my daughter and her grandmother. Her grandmother noticed that she wasn't feeling so good, so she went into action, sat next to her, and started soothing her. A very nice grandmother, I think. Here's her grandfather doing the same thing, listening, taking action, making sure that my daughter knew that somebody cared about her situation. And there he is giving her a big hug. So this is something behavioral, this is something that can be witnessed, and this becomes really important. When we think about this from an evolutionary perspective, let's take the consideration and perspective of Darwin, Charles Darwin, or as I like to call him, Chuck D. Darwin had this unique perspective that's often misinterpreted as evolution is survival of the fittest, red in tooth and claw, when in fact Darwin, in his books and in his writing, made sure that people understood here that sympathy will have been increased through natural selection. For those communities, which included the greatest number of the most sympathetic members, would flourish the best and rear the greatest number of children or offspring. So it becomes really important to take this into consideration when we think about what compassion is. Let's think about it again from evolutionary perspectives. In terms of non-related cooperation, think about marriages, let's say, or dating, or even workplace relationships. Non-related cooperation would be things like individuals actually favoring relationships with people who are more agreeable and compassionate. Why? Because compassion is a necessary component of trust, and it's difficult on occasion to trust across non-relatives. This becomes really important. Here's a picture of myself and my wife and the former mayor of San Francisco, Willie Brown. It was a cheap wedding. There's also the component of sexual selection theory, which really makes a great deal of sense. Being kind, taking action when someone is suffering, creates communities that take care of the survival of very vulnerable offspring. So here you can see my little wonderkind a couple years back, us taking good care of them. So it's critical to understand the impact of compassion across the board. We know that compassion is really strongly correlated with improved immune system functioning as well as physical well-being. But when you really think about it, its impact on psychological well-being is critical as well. So the question really becomes, why is this something that only the enlightened folks over at Western Connecticut State are talking about, or in such few places around the world, or if they're talking about it, they're talking about it in these real abstractions. Maybe one of the reasons is that, intellectually speaking, compassion has been frowned upon quite frequently in the Western intellectual tradition. So, for example, Immanuel Kant saw sympathy as good-natured emotion being weak and blind. Ayn Rand, a classic in terms of her libertarian perspectives, if any civilization is to survive, it is the morality of altruism that men have to reject. And Machiavelli, of course, another bright star in the Western tradition of mankind, we may say in general they're fickle, hypocritical, and greedy of gain. All this goes to say that we're already dealing with the cards stacked against us when we feel compassion. So we know that there are blocks to compassion. We know that they come from our intellectual environment, sometimes our political environment, sometimes our social environment, and we feel these things. So I ask you, have you ever felt scared of positive emotions? Maybe of being compassionate? There are a couple of reasons why you might be. If you're compassionate with others, are you worried they're going to take advantage of you? You might feel this way. Are you fearful of receiving compassion from others? Do you think they're going to manipulate you in your weakened state? Is this something that you feel? Or are you worried about being compassionate with yourself? Are you feeling like maybe that would be too indulgent, taking a little bit of time for yourself, a little bit of care in regards to your own needs? We're often our own toughest critics. So in thinking about these things, a brilliant English psychologist, Paul Gilbert, has worked in the area of compassion for quite some time, recently put together a fantastic psychometric scale to measure fear of compassion, specifically measuring fear of compassion for others, expressing this, fear of receiving compassion from others, and also fear of actually expressing it for yourself. So this is something that recently I've been doing some research on, and suffice to say, understanding that giving and receiving compassion is related to measures of stress, anxiety, and depression becomes really interesting. And let me point out a few of these simple correlations. We'll talk a little bit about some other research in a few minutes. But looking at fear of being compassionate to others, it's significantly related with stress, anxiety, and depression. But when we look at receiving compassion from others or compassion for oneself, these relationships get very strong and they're very significant. What this tells you is that people are not oftentimes willing to receive compassion. This data set comes from students in the business department at my home school. So let's talk about students and their choice for their discipline as well as their organizational choices and job choices. Business students oftentimes manifest a high preference for hierarchies in society. They like being at the top of the pyramid. Sadly, in various measures of this, specifically social dominance orientation, we find strong relationships between things that don't make people very happy in the workplace, or elsewhere for that matter. Things like sexism, racism, and oftentimes political economic conservatism. The sad situation here is that when people rank high on these measures of social dominance orientation, they want to go into organizations that maintain or increase social inequality and sometimes take in hierarchy-enhancing roles in organizations. They want to be on top, and they're not scared to force their way there. So sadly, when we think about these high levels of social dominance orientation, we find low levels of compassion for others, increased levels of fear of compassion for others, from others, or receiving it from others, as well as for oneself, and much higher levels, significantly higher levels, of anxiety, depression, and stress. So going back to our intellectual heritage, interestingly, these are all partially significantly mediated by adherence to free market ideology. In other words, when you take into consideration people's adherence and belief in free market ideology, the impact of these relationships is all this talk of stress is probably making you think about your current state at Western Connecticut. Think about it. As you get closer towards the final period and your final reports, final presentations, you're feeling a little bit more stressed? Probably most students are. So we have to think about the impact of stress on academic performance. Well, people who are too stressed out have lower GPAs. They don't do very well. They drop out more frequently. So stress has an impact on student climate. How are we usually measuring student climate? Well, frankly, usually through student climate surveys. Now, student climate surveys are used for a host of different purposes. Sometimes they're used for accreditation purposes. Sometimes they're used to really kind of put the thumb on the pulse of the student body, their mood, and also to get insights as to what students need and what they want. It relates to things like whether or not they'll give back as alumni, something that's very important to administrators. So these things are done longitudinally. So we know that stress has an impact on student climate, which is important, but thinking about stress, I had a great conversation with a former student, and the student said to me, "Hey, Dr. Martin, we were talking about crime maps." He said, "Wouldn't it be neat if we could actually map compassion in our environment?" Now, first let's tell you about crime maps. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but a crime map looks kind of like a Google map with pins in it that represent where crimes have taken place. Maybe theft, maybe burglary, maybe homicide, whatever the case may be. And they exist for most cities and most environments. Whatever the case, the student was interested in mapping compassion. So I thought to myself, that's a really difficult thing to do. How would you actually do that? But going back to our definition, that is behavioral of compassion, really it's action-based. It is someone taking steps to ameliorate another's suffering. So suddenly, this thought came to mind about actually performing an experiment that would leverage not only the witnessing of compassion and prosociality in one's environment, but also put it in a framework that was geographic and temporal in representation. So let me explain. I love crime maps, they're really cool, but I started looking for other types of maps that could be used. Well, good news, there's an open source tool called Ushahidi, and Ushahidi is Swahili for witness, and it's an easily programmed tool that enables one to make maps of almost anything and to set them free for others to participate in. So we created a map that actually used student climate variables to measure prosociality and compassion in one's environment. We had the tool, we had the items to measure prosociality and compassion, because when you look at the kinds of things that go into a student climate survey, generally speaking, it's just prosociality or compassion scaled from negative to positive. So we needed something to really make this zing. We needed to have a mechanism by which we could understand how people would be interpreting the positive environmental cues of witnessing people doing good things for each other. So the good news is there's a construct called elevation. Elevation has been used to study that feeling you have when you witness something really positive in your environment happening. Jonathan Haidt is one good researcher in this environment. I encourage you to take a look at his work. But this is when you maybe see a positive ending at a movie theater. You feel great, and you just want to hold the door open a little bit longer for everybody as they leave. Maybe you want to pay the parking for the person behind you. Maybe you're just a little bit nicer as you drive home. You drive slower and more considerately. Let somebody get in front of you. This is elevation. So the interesting thing about elevation is not only is it a positive emotion that's occurring after you witness something outside of you, but it's also something that seems to impact the likelihood that you will behave positively as you move forward from that moment. So we had all these pieces of the puzzle together. Let me explain a few of the student climate variables that we used. Things like courtesy, opening doors, student tutoring help, mentoring, sharing resources, good food, of course, ethnic group collaboration, interpersonal validation, and a sense of belonging to the school. These are all really critical things. So let's dive into this map and take a look at what it showed us. So before we even go into the map, I should express how we conducted this experiment. Before we actually let people utilize the map for a week, we collected pre-manipulation data. Okay, so the people who actually participated in the experiment were broken into two groups randomly. There's about 100 people in the control group. They did not receive the map condition, and there's about 100 people in the mapping condition where they actually participated for a week mapping prosocial behavior. So what were the things that we included in our pre-measure? We included measures of psychological flourishing, as well as compassion for others, and measures of elevation, mindfulness, and a few other things like stress, anxiety, and depression. So let's go into the map and take a look at what it showed us. Well, first off, we can see here that this is where the school is located, and I told students just to map at school. You can see they had a really hard time staying on target, because once they started witnessing prosociality and compassion in their environment, they loved doing this. So we dive in a little bit closer. you can see the campus is scattered with dots, and each one of these dots actually represents something. So some prosociality or some compassion. So in this circumstance, somebody witnessed students caring for each other, and if we dive in a little bit closer, you can see that there was a classmate who was very sick and left the classroom. The student accompanied him to make sure that everything is okay. So each one of these dots represents a compassionate circumstance. Let's dive into our outcomes. Well, we already described how the business students were broken into two groups, and after a week of observing prosocial and compassionate behavior, the manipulation group, the people who actually worked with the maps, were statistically significantly manifesting higher levels of flourishing as well as compassion for others. Very interestingly as well, the higher their levels of elevation, they had higher levels of observing, describing, and awareness in terms of the 5-facet scale of mindfulness. They had higher levels of flourishing, and lower levels of depression as well. So they had lower levels of fear of offering compassion to others and to themselves as well. So this is really important for a couple of different reasons. One, we can show qualitatively and quantitatively now that just witnessing prosociality and compassion in one's environment impacts one's psychological well-being. The really intriguing phenomenon that occurred here also was that the control group that did not receive the manipulation actually showed statistically significantly higher levels of stress, anxiety, and depression, which was mitigated by the manipulation itself. So what this says is, like you and like the rest of the students out there, as you go through the school year, as you move towards your finals, you become a little bit more anxious, you become a little bit more stressed, you become a little bit more depressed. But our manipulation actually mitigated that impact just over the course of 1 week with witnessing one act of prosociality a day. So what are our next steps? Obviously we're doing some longitudinal data collections, and we're going to be doing this in the broadest range of human organizations. Specifically, we're doing some organizational mapping with an organization in Silicon Valley. We're mapping social capital across universities, as well as mapping the quality of life in cities. The nice thing about these maps is you can overlay layers from a wide array of other secondary data resources like the census or other types of data points. I really want to stop and thank you guys. You've given me too much of your time. You're too kind. I really appreciate this. A couple other projects that are going on right now in regards to compassion. We're doing some work on compassion and competence in Sweden. We're doing some work on self-affirmation and behavioral tracking at Stanford, looking at transparency and compassion in banking. We're looking at developing praise scales that have a lot to do with compassion as well, prosociality and compassion mapping, we spoke about this today, as well as looking at social dominance orientation and ideology with a wide range of collaborators. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to talk to you. You can reach me via email or you can reach me via LinkedIn. Let me thank Dr. Cook for the invitation to present and all the students who have done such a fantastic job putting this together. Thank you again, and please have a wonderful rest of the afternoon.